Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. Davenport, Iowa. The last weekend of 2013. 29-year-old Carrie Olson doesn't show up for work. She doesn't answer her phone. Her car is parked outside her home, but she's gone. Within hours, friends and family notice something isn't right. What starts as quiet worry turns into an urgent case that spreads across state lines, leaving investigators chasing small traces of evidence through one of the coldest winters in the Midwest. Carrie Olson wasn't a stranger in her community. She worked at a pet supply store, often seen by customers and neighbors as dependable and kind. She was close to her parents, who lived only minutes away, and she had a circle of friends who described her as reliable. That's what made her sudden silence so concerning. It was out of character for her not to call, not to text, and not to show up. On the night of December 28th, surveillance cameras at a convenience store captured her image. She walked in, purchased a few items, and left. Nothing in the footage showed distress. She appeared normal, as if it were any other night. Hours later, in the early morning of December 29th, her digital trail abruptly changed. At 6:17 a.m., her debit card was used at a get-and-go in Rock Island. The transaction failed. At 6:22 a.m., another attempt at a nearby 7-Eleven also failed. A small purchase went through minutes later, and then at 6:33 a.m., there were multiple declined attempts to withdraw $400 from an ATM. All of this happened while Carrie herself was nowhere to be seen. By December 30th, she missed work. Her employer contacted her parents. Calls went unanswered. Messages stayed unread. That afternoon, her parents drove to her home in Davenport. The car was there. Inside, the home was quiet, no signs of forced entry, no struggle. Her purse wasn't in sight, but her belongings otherwise appeared untouched. It looked ordinary, almost too ordinary. Sometimes investigators say the absence of disturbance is its own anomaly. That evening, her parents filed a missing person report. Dispatch logged the time and sent officers to make preliminary checks. Within minutes, the case moved beyond family worry to official police response. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen Carrie leave or return. Neighbors hadn't. Friends couldn't recall anything unusual from the last time they spoke with her. There were no immediate leads. As the first hours passed, police marked the case as suspicious. Carrie's phone activity had stopped abruptly after December 28th. There were no outgoing calls, no texts, no data usage. That kind of silence is rare, investigators noted, for someone in daily contact with friends and family. It was negative evidence, but in missing person investigations, silence can weigh heavily. Investigators also pulled her financial logs. Those early morning card transactions on December 29th became the first solid data points. They established a timeline that suggested someone had access to her card after she disappeared. The problem was the transactions didn't match her usual spending habits. And more troubling, when surveillance footage from one of the stores was retrieved, the person making the purchase wasn't Carrie. At this stage, law enforcement couldn't confirm what had happened. They only knew that Carrie was missing, her car was unused, her home intact, her phone silent, and her debit card in the hands of someone else. Detectives began building a log of activity, noting what was absent as much as what was present. For investigators, early days in a case are critical. The first 48 hours often set the tone. Leads either come quickly or the trail begins to fade. In this case, by the turn of the year, there was no sign of Carrie. Flyers went up, media outlets began reporting, and the community joined in the search. But without fresh information, the missing person case hovered between worry and uncertainty. And for the Olson family, each passing day without an update felt heavier. They had to face the possibility that Carrie hadn't simply walked away. When investigators checked her phone records, they found no calls placed to friends, no texts to explain an absence. This wasn't someone planning to disappear. The case was officially escalated. Detectives logged every minute detail. Car parked at residence, no forced entry, purse missing, no travel confirmed. Each piece went into the file. It looked like an ordinary life paused suddenly without explanation. As one detective later put it was the stillness of the scene that told us something was wrong. That stillness would not last long. Once the financial records were aligned with surveillance video, investigators knew the disappearance was not voluntary. Someone else was in possession of Carrie's belongings, and that meant foul play was a working theory. The investigation now needed to move from home checks and phone logs to something deeper, a search for physical traces that could point to what happened after she vanished. The absence of leads in Davenport had left investigators circling the same ground. What they needed was a new layer of evidence, something concrete that could either confirm foul play or point toward a cause. That shift came months later, when the case file moved from missing person into homicide classification. By then, the focus was no longer on her house, her car, or her phone. It was on her remains and what the morgue could extract from them. At the medical examiner's office in Minnesota, the work was clinical and deliberate. Every step, from the transport of the body to the storage of clothing and hair samples, was logged under chain of custody protocols. Nothing moved without signature. Nothing was touched without a sterile barrier. It was the kind of process designed not just to gather evidence, but to prevent the defense from ever arguing contamination later in court. The first examination confirmed what the missing person file had not. Carrie Olson was dead. Cause of death could not be assigned with precision. The remains did not show blunt force trauma, nor the clear signs of strangulation or gunshot. Toxicology reports came back negative for lethal levels of substances. What the examiner could say, however, was that the death was a homicide, undetermined means. In forensic language, that category carries weight. It acknowledges intent without speculation about method. Hair samples revealed something unusual. Microscopic analysis pulled foreign carpet fibers tangled in strands. The fibers did not match clothing or outdoor material. They suggested indoor transfer before the body was moved. That single finding turned into a working lead, hinting that Carrie had been in an environment with that specific type of flooring in her final hours. From the remains, investigators also lifted scrapings beneath her fingernails. DNA analysis began in stages. Preliminary results showed the presence of genetic material not easily excluded from comparison. While the defense could argue contamination or transfer, the presence of foreign DNA in such a location kept homicide on the table as an active theory. Even the soil attached to fragments of clothing mattered. Samples were divided, cataloged, and stored. Forensic geologists later compared them to regions along highways between Illinois and Minnesota, looking for consistency in mineral profile. The idea wasn't to prove a burial site, there wasn't one, but to establish whether the body had been transported and staged. Negative evidence also played a role. There were no defensive wounds. There were no fractures consistent with struggle. For investigators, that suggested two possibilities. Either incapacitation occurred quickly, or there was limited opportunity for resistance. It also meant that reconstructing events required heavy reliance on circumstantial evidence, rather than clear-cut autopsy markers. Throughout the process, detectives attended briefings at the morgue. They listened as forensic pathologists explained findings in plain language. They noted the gaps: no cause of death, no weapon, no clear scene of violence. But they also logged the details that could be linked to other parts of the case file: carpet fibers, soil composition, and the chain of custody that ensured each piece could be presented in court. What makes this stage critical in any crime investigation is that it shifts the narrative from missing to murder. Families often describe this as the moment when hope collapses into certainty. For the Olson family, the official word, homicide, undetermined means, carried both closure and devastation. It confirmed Carrie had not walked away. It also left them with no explanation of how or why. From an investigative standpoint, the morgue findings built the procedural skeleton of the case. Without visible trauma, the cause of death would remain a gap in the file. Prosecutors would eventually have to argue circumstantial chains rather than direct forensic proof. Still, even without a weapon, fibers and DNA are evidence. They can link people and places. They can bridge timelines where witnesses cannot. One detective remarked privately, "The body itself had no voice left, but the trace evidence spoke louder than anything else." That trace evidence became the bridge to the next phase, following digital and financial logs that might place suspects in proximity to Carrie at the time her card was used and her phone went silent. When physical evidence leaves more questions than answers, investigators turn to what cannot lie: Digital logs and financial records, these traces captured by machines and time-stamped, often become the backbone of modern crime investigations. In Carrie Olsen's case, the early hours of December 29th had already shown anomalies. Surveillance footage from Rock Island convenience stores revealed someone using her debit card, but it wasn't her. Those attempts were more than suspicious, they were actionable data points. Detectives understood that every swipe, every failed transaction, added another layer to the timeline that could be verified. The first step was to build a chronological sequence of all transactions tied to Carrie's account. Within minutes, analysts had pulled records showing the get-and-go, then the 7-Eleven, then the ATM withdrawal attempts. Each event was matched against surveillance video. Investigators confirmed the timing, the physical presence of an individual at the terminal, and the absence of Carrie herself. It was circumstantial, but it was strong. Her financial identity was being used while she had gone silent. Technicians worked alongside detectives to recover the surveillance tapes. Grainy but serviceable, the footage captured movements, clothing, posture. The person on camera acted quickly, entering, swiping, leaving. The images were archived, tagged, and entered into evidence logs. Working theory: whoever held Carrie's card either had direct involvement in her disappearance or obtained it shortly after. From there, detectives expanded. Bank statements showed no additional spending beyond those early hours. That abrupt stop became as telling as the attempted withdrawals themselves. It suggested that whoever had the card either abandoned further use to avoid detection or had no access to her accounts beyond that morning. In forensic accounting, absence is sometimes as useful as presence. Cell site analysis added another angle. Even though her phone had gone dark after the evening of December 28th, records from nearby towers allowed investigators to establish its last known movement. The device did not ping from her home in Davenport after that night. Instead, data showed proximity to Rock Island, aligning with the debit card usage. After those early morning hours, no further signals were logged. Investigators now had digital and financial evidence converging on the same narrow window of time. Detectives also canvassed the ATM where the attempted withdrawals occurred. Machines store internal logs beyond just failed transactions, timestamps, card numbers, even camera footage when available. The logs confirmed repeated attempts to withdraw $400. The attempts failed due to incorrect PIN entry. That detail raised a critical inference. If Carrie herself had been making the withdrawal, she would not have mistyped her own PIN multiple times. The working theory solidified. Someone else had the card and lacked her personal knowledge. Investigators documented this as a turning point. In reports, they noted that financial and digital anomalies could not be explained by voluntary disappearance. If Carrie had simply chosen to leave, her accounts would not be accessed in this erratic way. More importantly, the individual seen on video was not her. These facts established a clear working trajectory. The case involved criminal activity, not absence by choice. Detectives brought in friends, co-workers, and family to review the surveillance images. While they could not make a positive identification, some described the clothing and build as resembling individuals known in Carrie's social circle. This was preliminary at best, but it guided where interviews would go next. What made this evidence powerful was its neutrality. Logs don't forget, and timestamps cannot be argued away. Still, building a prosecution required more than pointing to strange withdrawals. Investigators needed to tie these anomalies to motive, opportunity, and physical connection to Carrie. At this stage, however, they had advanced from missing person status into a homicide investigation backed by data. A detective later commented in a briefing, "The financial trail doesn't tell us how Carrie died, but it tells us someone was living in her absence, using her identity, and that's not something you can ignore." For the Olsen family, the news was devastating. It meant her disappearance wasn't just unexplained, it was exploited. Someone had used her life even briefly for their own gain. It made the crime feel not only violent but invasive. Cases like this raise a simple but difficult question. How do you prove intent when the only voice left is a line of digital code? That is why the investigation pressed forward into victimology, understanding Carrie's relationships, her circle, and who might have both access and reason to harm her. Carrie Olsen was 37 years old at the time she vanished. Friends remembered her as dependable, gentle, someone who rarely broke routine without explanation. Investigators working a crime like this knew that to understand her disappearance, they had to understand her life. Victimology is not speculation, it is structured profiling. It tells detectives who the victim was, what patterns defined her, and who had access to her trust. In Davenport, Carrie was known to split her time between work and social circles that revolved around family, longtime friends, and two men who remained closely linked to her, Greg McVeigh and Jason, her more recent partner. Law enforcement learned quickly that she maintained contact with both, and this overlap became a point of escalation during the investigation. From the outside, it looked like ordinary complexity, friendships turning into romantic entanglements. But when a woman goes missing, such details shift from personal to evidentiary. Detectives interviewed coworkers first. Their accounts showed Carrie as reliable, someone who would not simply abandon her schedule. Within minutes of her not appearing for a shift, colleagues grew concerned. Later that night, when she failed to answer her phone, the worry amplified. This behavior, they reported, was entirely inconsistent with her character. That discrepancy became a working red flag. Voluntary absence was unlikely. Investigators then spoke with family members. Her parents described her as someone who valued constant contact. Calls, texts, visits, they were part of her rhythm. No phone activity after December 28th was not only unusual, it was a confirmed anomaly against years of documented behavior. Families in these moments often become both witnesses and secondary victims. Their grief sharpened into certainty. Something had gone wrong. The focus then shifted to her relationships. Friends described tensions in the months before she disappeared. Some recalled that Carrie struggled to balance lingering ties with her former boyfriend while building a life with someone new. Such relational overlaps are not uncommon, but in a forensic setting, they are mapped as potential triggers. Detectives wrote in their logs that escalation may derive from relational conflict, monitor for opportunity and motive. Social media review confirmed the pattern. Posts showed Carrie appearing upbeat, yet exchanges between her and close contacts hinted at strain. This evidence was not definitive, but it added context. Crime investigation in 2013 had already shifted toward digital footprints, and detectives knew that even seemingly casual posts could establish timelines, moods, and interpersonal friction. One investigator later commented in a briefing, "You don't only look at who loved her, you look at who might have felt rejected or who stood to lose control." This principle directed interviews. Detectives questioned both men in Carrie's life. Answers were cataloged, compared against digital and financial anomalies already logged in Chapter 3. Each response became another data point. During these interviews, inconsistencies began to emerge. One account of December 28th placed her at home. Another suggested she had gone out late. Working notes flagged contradictions but avoided premature conclusions. In crime reports, consistency of detail is often as valuable as physical evidence. By early 2014, the narrative investigators built around Carrie showed a woman embedded in a normal life, steady employment, steady communication, steady routines. The break in that pattern was abrupt and absolute. That kind of rupture, experts testified, almost never occurs without external force. Victimology therefore reinforced what financial anomalies had already suggested. Carrie did not vanish by choice. For viewers listening to this sequence, the question becomes sharper. How do relationships, which to the outside appear ordinary, transform into avenues of risk? In towns like Davenport, where people pride themselves on knowing one another, the sudden absence of a trusted figure is not just disappearance, it is violation. The Olsen family, meanwhile, pressed investigators for answers. Public appeals were made, vigils were organized, and community involvement grew. These actions applied pressure, but they also showed the human side of crime. Each procedural step carried real emotional cost. Families wait not only for justice, but for explanation. Detectives understood the urgency. With each interview, they built a clearer picture. Carrie was targeted not by a stranger, but likely by someone within her close circle. That finding escalated the case further, narrowing the focus from open-ended missing person to intimate partner homicide investigation. The next step, investigators knew, would be to align victimology with forensic data. If the relationships pointed inward, then the charging theory had to be built outward through corroboration and evidence admissible in court. By early 2014, the Olsen investigation had shifted from missing person to homicide suspicion. The escalation did not come from one dramatic breakthrough, but from a series of accumulating anomalies. financial irregularities, relationship tensions, and a body recovered under circumstances that removed the possibility of voluntary disappearance. Once victimology established Carrie as a person unlikely to walk away, the task for investigators became building a theory of charge strong enough to survive scrutiny in court. In homicide investigations, charging theory is the bridge between suspicion and indictment. It requires more than motive. It requires demonstrable evidence of act, means, and opportunity. For law enforcement in Davenport and Rock Island County, that meant aligning every scrap of forensic data, interview testimony, and jurisdictional record into one coherent narrative. Detectives began with physical evidence already in hand. Preliminary lab results showed no forced entry in Carrie's residence, no signs of a stranger intruding. Negative evidence, what was missing, carried as much weight as what was present. The absence of defensive disruption in her apartment supported the working theory that whoever she left with was familiar, someone she trusted. That narrowed the suspect pool but also demanded corroboration. Next came digital traces. Call logs demonstrated abrupt silence after December 28th. Location data, while limited in scope, showed activity aligning with known acquaintances. Investigators highlighted these records in reports marked "Working requires corroboration." In building a charging theory, detectives could not afford overreach. Every inference had to tie back to verifiable data. Financial records added another layer. Bank statements showed no withdrawals or transactions after her disappearance. For a woman who maintained steady finances, this lack of activity was a confirmed anomaly. In crime analysis, the sudden halt of financial behavior is a red flag. It points away from voluntary flight and toward foul play. Interviews filled in the gaps. Friends described seeing Carrie with her former partner in the days leading up to December 28th. Others confirmed she expressed unease about strained dynamics. These accounts were coded as testimonial evidence. They did not yet amount to proof, but they provided motive and context, both vital for charging decisions. At this stage, jurisdiction became an obstacle. Carrie's disappearance originated in Davenport, Iowa, but her body was discovered across the state line in Rock Island County, Illinois. Two separate legal systems now intersected. Davenport Police, Rock Island County Sheriff's Office, and the FBI's Quad Cities Safe Streets. Task Force coordinated efforts. Meetings were scheduled, evidence was exchanged under chain of custody protocols, and jurisdictional boundaries were carefully documented to prevent procedural challenges later in court. One internal report summarized the situation bluntly. Cross-border homicide, charging theory, requires coordinated presentation of evidence admissible in both jurisdictions. This was not just a bureaucratic formality. In homicide trials, defense counsel often targets procedural lapses, especially in multi-agency investigations. Detectives understood that every lab result, every interview, every transport record had to be airtight. The charging theory began to crystallize around one suspect. Investigators identified opportunity through documented contact, means through access to Carrie, and motive through deteriorating personal dynamics. Yet detectives knew motive was not enough. To proceed, prosecutors demanded evidence that connected suspect action directly to Carrie's disappearance and death. That link emerged through a combination of forensic review and testimonial contradiction. Statements given by the primary suspect about his whereabouts were inconsistent with cell site records. While not GPS precise, tower pings placed him in locations that conflicted with his own account. In a jury trial, such discrepancies could be powerful. Prosecutors in Rock Island reviewed the cumulative file. They weighed the digital evidence, the victimology, the lack of voluntary activity, and the suspect's inconsistent statements. Together, these strands formed what in charging theory is called a reasonable prospect of conviction. It was not a single piece of evidence but a mosaic, each tile strengthening the next. Community awareness added pressure. Public vigils kept Carrie's name alive. Media outlets reported updates, emphasizing the interstate dimension of the crime. With visibility came urgency. Detectives had to balance the public's demand for quick resolution with the methodical pace required for a homicide prosecution. As one investigator later reflected, "You only get one chance to do this right. If you rush, you risk collapse in court." By mid-2014, the interagency task force had built a unified narrative. Davenport officers could demonstrate the disappearance, Rock Island authorities could establish body recovery, and prosecutors on both sides could argue continuity of criminal conduct. That alignment gave them confidence to move forward with charging. For viewers, this stage of the story illustrates a critical truth about real-world crime. Resolution is not cinematic. It is slow, layered, and often defined by paperwork as much as evidence. Yet in its details, the process reveals the gravity of homicide work. Each entry in a logbook, each signed chain of custody slip, each confirmed call record becomes part of the scaffolding of justice. The charging decision was not an ending, but a transition. From this point forward, the investigation's task was to shift into trial preparation, refining timelines, ensuring witness availability, and anticipating defense challenges. Interagency cooperation, once a procedural necessity, became the backbone of the prosecution's case. And so the Olson investigation moved into its next phase. Detectives had mapped Carrie's last known movements, examined her relationships, confirmed her absence as involuntary, and aligned jurisdictions. What remained was to bring that evidence into court, where the final test of truth would be presented before a jury. The bridge from the charging decision to the courtroom was swift compared to many homicide cases. By mid-2015, the Scott County prosecutors believed they had built enough of a chain, digital traces, behavioral anomalies, and the timeline of Carrie Olson's disappearance, to secure a conviction. The defense argued the evidence was circumstantial, but in the American justice system, circumstantial evidence, when layered and consistent, can prove just as persuasive as direct physical proof. The courtroom in Davenport filled each morning with reporters, family members, and a community still unsettled by the abrupt loss of a young woman whose absence had rippled through 2 states. Carrie Olson's parents sat quietly in the first row, their eyes locked forward. Behind them, friends who had posted missing flyers in the early days now faced the weight of a homicide trial. Jurors, selected after intense questioning about their views on forensics and relationship violence, were sworn to put aside emotion and judge the case solely on the evidence presented. The prosecution opened with a simple theme. Carrie Olson was alive and well until she encountered Timothy McVeigh. After that night, she was never seen alive again. They outlined a sequence of facts designed to appear seamless. Security footage from a gas station captured McVeigh's vehicle at a critical window of time. Cell site records placed his phone on a path leading toward the area where Carrie's body would later be found. A friend testified about his demeanor, withdrawn, anxious, inconsistent in his accounts of when he last saw her. These strands, prosecutors insisted, formed a rope of accountability. The defense countered by highlighting what was missing. There was no eyewitness to violence, no confession, no clear cause of death that could exclude every alternative explanation. They leaned heavily on the absence of DNA or fingerprints tying McVeigh directly to a lethal act. Suspicion, defense counsel argued, is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They sought to create daylight between suspicion and certainty, reminding jurors that criminal law requires the highest burden of proof. Testimony unfolded over several weeks. Detectives described how McVeigh had been cooperative at times, resistant at others. They explained the meticulous process of subpoenaing phone records, triangulating towers, and comparing activity to typical patterns. Forensic analysts detailed the chain of custody of physical exhibits, making clear that nothing had been contaminated or misfiled. Each explanation reinforced the image of a careful, methodical investigation rather than a rushed presumption. One of the most critical witnesses was a forensic pathologist who had examined Carrie Olson's remains. While decomposition prevented an exact cause of death from being pinpointed, the pathologist testified that the condition of the body was inconsistent with natural causes. There were no signs of long-term disease or sudden medical collapse. The conclusion, her death was a homicide of undetermined mechanism. That phrase, homicide of undetermined mechanism, would echo throughout closing arguments, both sides trying to bend it toward their narrative. Prosecutors emphasized behavioral evidence. They presented texts and call logs that showed Carrie had been active and engaged in the hours before her disappearance. Her sudden silence was an anomaly, one that investigators treated as negative evidence, a break in digital life as telling as any physical trace. They highlighted how McVeigh's explanations shifted under questioning. He described their relationship as amicable, But witnesses recalled arguments, jealousy, and lingering control. For jurors, this pattern of contradiction suggested consciousness of guilt. The defense attempted to introduce alternative scenarios. Perhaps Carrie had overdosed. Perhaps she had wandered. Perhaps another unknown party was involved. Yet they could not align these theories with the geographic path of McVeigh's vehicle, the digital records, or the time frame in which Carrie vanished. Jurors listened closely, but as often happens in homicide trials without direct evidence, the question became whether the absence of a plausible alternative reinforced the prosecution's case. Cross-examinations were sharp. When detectives were asked if they had ever considered other suspects, they explained that leads had been pursued and excluded, narrowing focus only after inconsistencies in McVeigh's accounts accumulated. When pressed on whether phone towers could sometimes misplace a device by a mile or two, analysts acknowledged the limitations, but clarified that the broad pattern remained consistent. The movements matched McVeigh, not a phantom. By the time closing arguments arrived, the stakes felt unmistakable. Prosecutors reminded jurors that circumstantial evidence can function like tiles in a mosaic. No single tile tells the story, but the full picture is unmistakable. Defense counsel urged jurors not to fill gaps with assumptions. "You must be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt," the defense insisted. "Not beyond suspicion, not beyond possibility." The jury deliberated for hours, then days. Inside the room, they re-examined call logs, debated the pathologist's cautious wording, and weighed the testimony of those who had seen McVeigh in the days after Carrie's disappearance. Jurors later told reporters that the evidence of deception, combined with the digital trail, outweighed the gaps. When the verdict was read, the courtroom held its breath. McVeigh was convicted of first-degree murder and concealment of a human corpse. Carrie's parents held each other, silent tears marking a moment they had long expected yet dreaded. For them, justice was partial. Nothing could restore their daughter, but it was justice nonetheless. The sentencing phase came quickly. The judge underscored the seriousness of the crime, noting both the deliberate concealment and the betrayal of trust inherent in the act. McVeigh received a lengthy prison term consistent with Iowa law. Appeals were anticipated even then, but the conviction stood as the official resolution of a case that had spanned across months of uncertainty and grief. In towns like Davenport, homicide trials are not just about determining guilt. They are about communities trying to reconcile the loss of trust that violent crime inflicts. For Carrie Olson's family, the trial marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, living with absence while knowing accountability had been rendered. For investigators, it affirmed that digital evidence, even without a single piece of direct proof, could withstand courtroom scrutiny when carefully layered and presented. The bridge from the trial courtroom to the appellate process was not one of new witnesses or fresh exhibits, but of written arguments and judicial review. By late 2015, Timothy McVeigh's defense team filed notice of appeal, arguing that the conviction had relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence. For Carrie Olson's family, it meant another cycle of waiting, though this time, instead of searching for their daughter, they waited for the courts to affirm that justice would remain intact. Appellate courts function differently from trial courts. There is no jury. There are no dramatic confrontations between counsel and witness. Instead, panels of judges review transcripts, evidentiary rulings, and legal standards. McVeigh's attorneys raised several points: that the jury instructions had been prejudicial, that the prosecution had overstated digital evidence, and that the court had erred in admitting certain testimony regarding his past behavior. Each ground was designed to chip away at the verdict, not by relitigating guilt, but by questioning whether the process had been legally sound. The state's attorneys responded with equal clarity. The evidence, while circumstantial, had been layered, consistent, and presented within the rules. They emphasized that McVeigh had been represented by counsel, that the jury had been instructed under Iowa law, and that the verdict reflected careful deliberation. More importantly, they argued, the absence of an alternative suspect or explanation only strengthened the reliability of the outcome. For Carrie's parents, reading the appellate briefs was a reminder of the clinical distance the law can place between human tragedy and procedural argument. Words like evidentiary standard and jury prejudice were abstractions compared to the real loss of a daughter. Still, they attended hearings when permitted, determined that their presence in courtrooms, even appellate ones, would signal that Carey's story could not be reduced to legal language alone. In 2019, the appellate court delivered its ruling. After reviewing the record, it upheld McVeigh's conviction. The judges concluded that the trial court had acted within its discretion, that the evidence was sufficient under Iowa law, and that no reversible error had occurred. For the Olson family, the decision carried finality. While further appeals to higher courts were theoretically possible, the affirmation closed the most direct path to overturning the conviction. Legal experts noted that the ruling reinforced the power of circumstantial evidence in homicide prosecutions. While critics sometimes argue that cases without eyewitnesses or confessions are fragile, appellate courts have consistently held that juries may infer guilt when independent strands of circumstantial proof align. In McVeigh's case, the cell records, behavioral inconsistencies, and concealment of the body form such a pattern. The impact of the appellate ruling extended beyond the legal documents. For local law enforcement, it was a moment of validation. Detectives who had faced criticism for focusing too narrowly on McVeigh now had their investigative choices ratified. For prosecutors, it confirmed that their theory of the crime had withstood not only jury scrutiny, but also judicial review. In the community of Davenport and across the river in Rock Island, the case became an example cited in legal training seminars: how to build a homicide case when direct physical evidence is absent or degraded. The aftermath, however, was not measured only in legal terms. Families never simply move on after homicide verdicts. Carey Olson's relatives continued to honor her memory through vigils and community events. Friends recalled her generosity, her humor, her presence in the workplace. Her absence remained a wound, but the certainty of McVeigh's conviction, upheld on appeal, provided a form of stability. They no longer had to fear a retrial or the reopening of painful testimony. McVeigh remained incarcerated, serving his sentence under the supervision of the Iowa Department of Corrections. Prison records showed routine behavior, assignments to work details, occasional disciplinary reports, and a lack of extraordinary incidents. For many offenders, the appeal process is a last lifeline. Once denied, the reality of decades behind bars becomes inescapable. As true crime stories often reveal, the courtroom is not the final chapter for families or communities. In Davenport, Carey Olson's name became tied to discussions of relationship violence and the importance of early intervention. Advocates used her story to emphasize how patterns of control and manipulation, if unchallenged, can escalate into lethal outcomes. For law students and young prosecutors, her case became a lesson in the evidentiary value of digital footprints and the limits of forensic certainty. The case also highlighted the resilience of families navigating the justice system. For the Olsons, justice did not mean closure, because closure suggests an end. Instead, justice meant recognition, that the courts had affirmed what they already knew, that Carey's life had been taken unlawfully, and that the man responsible was held to account. When appellate judges issued their written opinion in 2019, it was not broadcast with dramatic headlines. Instead, it appeared in legal bulletins and local papers, a reminder that justice often concludes quietly. Yet for those closest to Carey, the silence was not emptiness. It was a space where grief could continue without the constant fear of reversal. Looking back across the span from late 2013 to 2019, the trajectory is clear. A disappearance that shook 2 states, an investigation built from fragments, a trial that tested the limits of circumstantial evidence, and an appeal that cemented the outcome. Each stage carried its own rhythm, its own weight, but all pointed toward the same conclusion. For viewers, the Olson case is more than a record of crime and punishment. It raises broader questions about the justice system itself. How do courts balance the absence of direct evidence with the presence of circumstantial patterns? How do families find strength in years of hearings, transcripts, and rulings that can feel detached from the human story underneath? And perhaps most importantly, what does justice look like when it can never fully restore what was lost? The 2015 verdict brought accountability, but not an end. Defense appeals argued the case was circumstantial and flawed. Yet in 2019, the conviction was affirmed. For Carey Olson's family, that ruling meant stability, no more fear of reversal, only the hard work of grieving with certainty. Law enforcement documented lessons from the cross-state investigation, streamlining evidence sharing between Iowa and Illinois. Prosecutors used the case to train others in how digital logs, financial patterns, and testimony can converge into proof beyond a reasonable doubt. For the community, Carrie's story became a point of awareness, discussions about relationship violence, boundaries, and recognizing warning signs. Real prevention work often leaves no headlines, but her absence fueled conversations that may save others. The system cannot restore what was lost, but it can hold accountable those responsible. In this crime, the judgment stood. Timothy McVeigh was convicted in 2015 for the murder and concealment of Carrie Olson, and the conviction was upheld on appeal in 2019. Final status. Judgment stands, a violent crime answered in court. When I look back on Carrie Olson's story, I see more than a crime. I see the fragile line between trust and danger, and how quickly silence can turn into tragedy. If sharing her case teaches us anything, it's that every relationship deserves honesty, respect, and boundaries. We cannot change what happened, but we can choose to notice warning signs, speak up, and protect one another before it's too late. What about you? Do you believe communities can prevent tragedies like this? Or are we always reacting after the damage is done? If this story touched you, leave a comment with your thoughts, or tell me where you're watching from. And if you'd like to join me for more true crime stories that carry lessons for all of us, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next case.